be seated. I have two things I want you to take away today, and I'm just going to tell you what they are. One is, how do you talk to people that you don't agree with? How do you talk to people whose worldviews are different than yours? Because we can't just push people away that we don't agree with. And I'll tell you about my little story about that. It has to do with Scripture, too. But the second thing is, why would God be merciful to us when we seem so reluctant to be merciful to others? That's what's in the story of Noah today, as far as I'm concerned. So let's talk about this story that I know you know. You learned it when you were a kid. This idea about the ark, right? And Noah, and the flood, and the animals. So no conversation in church about Noah can start without first naming the elephants in the room. See what I did there? You get it? Yeah. Two elephants. Everything, two. I had to explain it to the first group, so I just wasn't sure if you obviously are more clever than they are. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. Now, and the reason you have to start there with the animals and the ark and all that jazz is it's so implausible, this story. This idea that you could get two of every animal. It's not just implausible, it really is impossible, I think. You can think anything you like. But we get so hung up, or at least I do, on the ark and the animals that we just check out of the story. And that's, I think, wrong. It's nice for kids, right? You know. But as an adult, my question is, as a child, you took this story on faith, right? But as an adult, what does this story of Noah and the ark and the flood mean to you? It's an old story. It's widespread. Every culture in the ancient Near East in this time had a story of a flood. We aren't the only ones who have this story. But we use it in a particular way. It is the way we use it, I think, as divisive as it is universal. So, a couple of years ago, Don and his group that go to Canada every year to fish invited me to go along, and I gleefully said yes. And so we went. And so it's a long trip to Canada where we go. We go all the way to Ontario, and it's a long, two-day deal. So you have to drive like 11 and a half hours, and you spend the night in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Okay, so we're in this hotel, a modest hotel in Grand Forks, and you have a small space to have breakfast afterwards in the morning. We get up and we're having breakfast, and we're sharing it with the people around us, you know, and people are walking around and talking, and there's this one guy that talks to everybody, so I like to talk to people, so we start talking, and what are you doing? Where are you going? We're going fishing. What about you? Where are you going? We are going to the Ark exhibit in Kentucky. Right next to the Creation Museum, they have built something called the Ark Experience. Now, do you know about this? Anybody? If you don't, you must go online and look at it. They took wood, and they had real craftsmen build an ark, the dimensions that the Bible talks about, right? And so it's there in Kentucky. And you go there, and someone tells you all about it, and they have all these exhibits. And part of what they have are exhibits of animals. They don't have live animals on the ark, but they have exhibits. And what was interesting to me about this conversation I was having on this morning in this motel, having breakfast, was I had just seen an article about this. And I had just seen a picture of the kind of animals that they have displayed on the ark. And guess what they have? Dinosaurs. And I thought, well, that's just crazy. They didn't have dinosaurs on the ark. But it's important to people that the Bible be a literally true story in every way. And so this guy was going off to see an ark, which I thought to be total nonsense, right? Parts of it. But I struggled to have a conversation because I didn't want to just not talk. And yet I was trying to figure out. And so what we had to do was find common ground about what we believed in. And I want to tell you, there are parts of the story that I believe are absolutely true, but not in the way that he thought. I don't suppose. See, I don't think that the Bible is science. I don't think that the story of the ark is science. And if we focus, I think, on the science, I think we will miss the incredible, revolutionary, theological learning that the person who wrote the story had for us. If we just focus on whether or not all the animals could fit on the ark, we're going to miss the idea that stands behind the story, which I'll tell you about. The authors, our authors of the Genesis flood story, used the science of their time to explain this theological reality that they observed, which was this. First, they believed, and I believe as well, that God is just and requires justice. One of God's great characteristics, abiding characteristics, central characteristics, is this need for justice, because God is just. Also, we learn and believe that God created us, the world, all the creatures in it, as a peaceful and unified creation. Yeah, I believe that too. But creation was, at the time of this writing of this story in Genesis, creation was being destroyed by violence and evil, which then must be punished by a just God. See? And yet, life continues and life abounds. How is it that a just God can allow a violent people who sometimes act in ways that are evil to continue to exist? Why didn't God just wipe us out? That's how the story goes. What is up? You all know why the story, you all know why the flood, right? Maybe you don't. I didn't. We all think of the flood like just like it started to rain. But what happened was God looked down at God's creation, and it says in Scripture, right before this part, it says, and every human's heart was turned always and ever to violence. Everything that God had created was being destroyed by the violence in God's creatures, including us. And so God said, well, I can't have that. I'm going to destroy them. And so God does, but God says, there's one righteous family, there's 8 of them, we'll start with them, we'll start all over, which the science of that gets a little murky, okay? But so don't worry about that part. But why did God save those 8 people? That's important. The other thing that's important, remember at the end of the story, what happens? God takes God's bow of a warrior, yeah? And God unstrings that bow and hangs it upside down in the sky as a reminder, not to us, but to God, that every time God wants to destroy us because we are violent and evil, God will look at that rainbow, that bow that he has hung up in the sky and say, I'm not going to do that again. It didn't work. God had to find another way to relate to us, is what I'm saying, besides what God was trying. Okay. What they found out in the part of this story that I think is so revolutionary is they found out that God must be more than just creative and more than just simply just. God must therefore be merciful if God will still stay in a relationship with us. Okay. We know all of this to be true. We know that God is perfection, but perfection in our world is always corrupted. Right? Plans get upended, beauty fades, love fails, life ends, good people get bad diseases, young people die at the hands of both tyrants and teammates. The world, you guys, is messed up, and people in it are good and bad, and none of this seems like it should be tolerable to a God who is at once good and just, and yet here we are. Why does God allow it? The authors of Genesis looked around and used this universal story to frame a startling theological discovery that God's nature is also merciful. The story of Noah's Ark is not about the wonder of God's science, it is about the wonder of God's love. It is about the revelation that it is in God's nature not only to create, but to save. What God did was limit God's power unilaterally and entered into a covenant with Noah that continues to this day, where God says, I could do what I should do, but I won't do it because I love you. and keeps giving us, I think, a chance to do better, right? By self-limiting God's own power to destroy us, God then becomes uniquely invested in our survival. God could have just wiped us out, but God said, no, I'm going to save you. And now since God did, God says, well, I got to keep it going, right? I just need to stay in relationship with you. And that's the covenant of Noah. How do I know all this? Well, I know it because I believe in the story. Right? I don't believe in the science part of it, but I believe in the theology part of it. I also believe this, that God is true to God's covenantal word. God said God would never destroy us again, right? So if we are ultimately destroyed, it will not be at God's hands, it will be at our own. Yeah? I have this in common with those folks in Kentucky. We both believe in this story. They believe that dinosaurs were on the ark and that the earth is 6,000 years old, which I do not believe. But I believe that God has had to learn and to change as God has found God's self in relationship with us. And somehow God had to come to grips with what can only be described as God's great dilemma. The dilemma that God had, and has, I suppose, still, is how to love creatures who refuse to love each other. I believe the story of Noah and the ark perfectly teach that lesson. Because God decided to try another approach, to start over, actually, is what God decided. It was a long time from Adam to Noah, right? And God tried it that way. And what God found out is we turned always to violence. And then God said, I'm not going to do it that way. And God begins a new part of this epic narrative of God's relationship with us. God says, I'm going to try mercy and love to go along with justice. And that's how we end up with Jesus and the cross. God didn't give up on us entirely, but God gave up on beating us into submission. God began that day to teach us love through mercy. God, I believe, has changed. The question is, when will we change? If God is committed to mercy, why are we still so committed to violence? I don't know much of anything for sure, but I believe that that is the question that is on God's heart today.